My sister grabbed the mic at my graduation party and humiliated me with embarrassing childhood stories, calling me too sensitive when I tried to stop her. 9 months later, I watched her being dragged out of court in handcuffs, screaming my name like I was the reason her world came crashing down. Imagine having a sister who didn't just dislike you, but actively tried to erase you, piece by piece, for your entire life. Now picture that same person, years later, standing in front of your closest friends and family, microphone in hand, ready to unleash the most humiliating public attack imaginable, all at the one moment you thought you could finally celebrate something good. That's my sister Tina, and what she did to me at my high school graduation party shattered everything. Honestly, Tina had been a nightmare since I could remember. When we were little, she once ripped the head off my favorite stuffed bunny, looked me straight in the eye, and sneered, "Well, now it's realistic. Bunnies die. Can you believe that?" If I got new clothes, she'd borrow them without asking, then return them stained or stretched out, laughing when I cried. For my 10th birthday, my mom got me a necklace I'd wanted for months. The very next day, Tina flushed it down the toilet during an argument, then gaslit me, saying, "You probably lost it. You're always careless." School was even worse. She'd spread the most vicious rumors, tell my crushes embarrassing lies, and openly mock me in front of her friends. If I got good grades, she'd accuse me of trying to make her look dumb. If I struggled, she'd tell everyone I was slow. My parents, bless their hearts, constantly brushed it off as sibling rivalry. You know the classic, "You two need to get along. One day you'll only have each other's" speech. But I learned early on that Tina didn't want to get along. She wanted me beneath her, humiliated, embarrassed. By high school, I was an expert at staying out of her way, but she still found ways to dig at me. When I joined the debate team and started winning, she'd mock me as the desperate nerd trying to be important. When I got accepted into my dream college, she just sneered, "Don't get too excited, you'll probably fail and come back." There was one thing I was truly looking forward to: my high school graduation party. It wasn't just about the party itself. It was about finally celebrating something I had worked for, something I had achieved, without Tina stealing the spotlight. My mom and dad agreed to let me host it in our backyard. I invited friends, teachers, extended family. I spent weeks planning every detail: fairy lights, a taco bar, a playlist I'd poured hours into. Of course, Tina wasn't happy. She started with the passive-aggressive comments. Why did she get a big party? I didn't get one. She did. She just didn't like parties. Back then. It's just high school. No one cares. I'm going to be so bored. I finally told her flat out, "If you can't be nice, just stay out of the way." She smirked and said, "Don't worry, I'll make it memorable." That should have been my warning. The aita day of the party, everything started beautifully. Then Tina made her move. First, she cranked the music to ear-splitting levels and started playing songs she knew I hated. When I told her to stop, she announced loudly to my friends, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize the party dictator was here." Then, while everyone was eating, she accidentally spilled soda all over the dessert table, ruining the cake, cupcakes, and the fruit display I had worked so hard on. She fake apologized in the most sarcastic voice possible. "Oops, my bad. Guess we'll have to diet today." But the worst part came later. While I was chatting with my old English teacher, Tina grabbed the microphone, the speech I didn't ask her to give. She started telling horrifyingly humiliating stories about me. Some exaggerated, some completely made up. One time she peed her pants in middle school. She once cried for an hour because I ate her cookie. Don't worry, she's going to be a great college student if she can survive without mom packing her. Lunch! Everyone was awkwardly laughing, but I could feel my face burning. I tried to grab the mic and she yanked it away. That's when I snapped. I told her to get out. She rolled her eyes. "Relax. It's just a joke. God, you're so sensitive." She left, but the damage was done. The entire vibe of the party was ruined. People kept trying to comfort me, but all I could think was, she did it again. She couldn't let me have this one day. After that, I stopped speaking to her entirely. I didn't answer her texts, her calls, or her sarcastic, "Sorry if you took it the wrong way" apology. Over the next few months, she kept trying to act like nothing happened. At family dinners, she'd sit next to me, ask about school like we were best friends. If I ignored her, she'd say, "Wow, still holding a grudge? You need to get over it." Finally, at Thanksgiving, she made one last dig. "You're acting like I ruined your wedding or something. It was just a high school party." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "It was my celebration. You ruined it on purpose. You've been tearing me down my whole life, and I'm done giving you access to me." And I meant it. I stopped inviting her to my events. I left family group chats. I told my parents point blank, if she's there, I'm not. Of course, the guilt tripping started immediately. Just last week, my mom called and said Tina was ready to talk. She put her on speaker without telling me, and the first words out of Tina's mouth were, "So, are you done being dramatic?" I hung up immediately. I threw my phone across the room where it bounced off my dorm wall. My hands were shaking as I picked it back up and blocked Tina's number for what had to be the 15th time this week. 20 minutes later, my roommate knocked on my door, holding her laptop with this weird look on her face. She showed me her Instagram messages, 3 new accounts, all created in the last hour, sending her walls of text about how I was mentally unstable and needed help. The usernames were random numbers, but the writing style? Pure Tina. My roommate watched as I took screenshots of everything and added them to the folder I'd started keeping on my laptop, labeled Evidence. The next morning at the cafeteria, my roommate sat down across from me. She pushed her tray aside and asked if any of what Tina said was true. I could see she wasn't sure what to believe. I pulled out my phone and showed her the video Jaime had recorded at my graduation party, where you could hear Tina's whole speech and see me trying to grab the microphone. My roommate's face went from confused to completely horrified as she watched. She said my sister was seriously messed up and asked if I'd talk to anyone about this. That afternoon, I walked to the campus counseling center. I stood outside for 10 minutes, just staring at the door before finally going in. The receptionist handed me an intake form. I sat there, pen hovering over the section about family relationships. There was a checkbox for family trauma, and my pen hovered for a full minute before I finally marked it. 3 days later, I was sitting in Dr. Rodriguez's office, telling her everything. About the stuffed bunny and how Tina had looked me in, the eye while ripping its head off. About the necklace going down the toilet, the graduation party, everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something that made my whole body feel lighter. She said what I'd experienced wasn't sibling rivalry, but systematic emotional abuse. That night, Leonard found me crying in the common room after my dad left a voicemail about how I was tearing the family apart. He sat down next to me, and I finally told him everything, from the beginning. He held me while I explained 20 years of being torn down and humiliated. He looked at me and said, "No wonder you flinch when people raise their voices." Later that week, I was alone in my room, scrolling through old family photos on my laptop. And something just hit me. In every single picture, Tina was either smirking at the camera or doing something to hurt me that looked playful but absolutely wasn't. She was pulling my hair, or pinching my arm, or stepping on my foot while everyone else smiled at the camera, oblivious. How did no one notice what was happening right in front of them? A week after that, I was studying when someone started pounding on my door. I opened it to find my mom standing there with Tina right behind her. My mom said we were going to talk this out like adults and started pushing past me into my room. I blocked the doorway. I told them to leave. Tina started screaming that I was being dramatic and selfish. My RA heard the commotion and came running down the hall. She asked if everything was okay, and I told her these people needed to leave. Tina started yelling that she was my sister and had every right to be there. Campus security showed up within minutes and escorted them both out while Tina screamed the whole way about how I was ruining everything. The next day, I met with campus legal services. They helped me file paperwork for a no trespass order. The advisor explained that if Tina's behavior escalated any further, I could qualify for a restraining order. That evening, Jaime called from back home, sounding exhausted. She said Tina had been telling everyone I'd had a mental breakdown at college and was making up lies for attention. Several people we knew from high school had reached out to Jaime, asking what was really going on. Jaime had been defending me, but she said it was getting harder because Tina was so convincing. 2 weeks later, I was back in Dr. Rodriguez's, office, and she handed me a stack of articles about narcissistic abuse. Everything suddenly made sense, as I read about gaslighting and public humiliation and how abusers always play the victim when confronted. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being too sensitive. I was angry, and for the first time, that felt like the right response. 2 days later, I was sitting in economics class when my phone buzzed with a call from my dad. I let it go to voicemail and listened to it after class. His voice sounded tired as he explained that Tina had been crying for weeks, and her therapist said family reconciliation was crucial for her healing. I recognized the manipulation immediately, but it still made my chest tight. Leonard found me that afternoon in the library and suggested we fix my social media situation once and for all. We spent 4 hours in his dorm room creating new accounts with fake names and maximum privacy settings, blocking every single person who might be connected to Tina, her friends, anyone from high school who might leak information. Each block felt like adding another brick to a wall between me and my old life. The weeks passed quickly with midterms and papers keeping me busy until suddenly it was almost Thanksgiving. My parents had been calling constantly, promising Tina would be at her boyfriend's family dinner in Chicago, swearing I could come home safely. Against every instinct screaming at me, I drove the 3 hours home, telling myself it would be fine, for just 2 days. I walked through the front door carrying my overnight bag and froze when I saw Tina sitting at the dining room table with that familiar smirk on her face. My mom appeared from the kitchen saying we needed to work this out as a family. I turned around without a word, got back in my car, and drove straight to Aunt Carol's house 20 minutes away. Carol opened the door in her pajamas, clearly surprised to see me standing there with my bag. But she pulled me inside and made coffee while I sat at her kitchen table. Over store-bought pumpkin pie, I told her everything, starting with the graduation, party, and working backward through years of torment. Her face got darker with each story until she finally set down her fork and said she'd always wondered why I was so quiet at family gatherings. The drive back to campus took longer because of holiday traffic. And when I finally got to my dorm room at midnight, I noticed immediately that my door was slightly open, even though I had definitely locked it. Nothing was stolen, but everything was wrong. My diary was on a different shelf, my laptop open when I'd left it closed, my dresser drawers not quite shut properly. My skin crawled as I checked every corner, finding subtle signs someone had touched everything. Campus security took a report, but without proof of forced entry or theft, they couldn't do much except promise to increase patrols. 3 days later, I was back in Dr. Rodriguez's office describing the violation when she helped me see the pattern of escalation in Tina's behavior, explaining that losing control over me was making her desperate. We spent the session creating a detailed safety plan with emergency contacts, documentation strategies, and specific protocols for different scenarios. I was walking back from that appointment when my phone dinged with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The message contained old Instagram photos I'd deleted months ago, edited to look compromising, with my face pasted onto other bodies in suggestive positions. The text was short, but I recognized Tina's writing style immediately in the threat, about sending them to my professors. I went straight to campus police where they took the blackmail threat seriously, bringing in a detective who specialized in cybercrime. She explained that blackmail was a felony, and they could trace IP addresses, officially opening an investigation that afternoon with case numbers and evidence logs. A week later, I was studying in the library when my mom called, hysterical and screaming that Tina had told her I was trying to get her arrested over nothing. She demanded I drop the charges immediately, saying I was destroying my sister's future over petty sibling squabbles. But I hung up while she was still mid-sentence. Leonard had been watching all of this unfold and talked to his parents about my situation during their weekly video call. His mom, who worked as a social worker, invited me to spend winter break with them at their house near Cleveland. When I arrived at their home 2 weeks later, his mother sat with me in their living room and gently validated everything I'd been through, marking the first time an adult had taken my side without trying to make excuses for Tina or push for reconciliation. When I got back to campus after winter break, the nightmares started right away. I'd dream about Tina standing in my dorm room doorway, or sitting in the back of my classes, or waiting outside my job at the campus bookstore. The dreams felt so real that I'd jolt awake at 3 a.m. and check my door lock 3 or 4 times before I could even think about going back to sleep. My roommate started asking if I was okay because I'd get up multiple times every night to make sure the door was locked and the windows were latched. The lack of sleep made everything harder, but I couldn't stop myself from checking and rechecking everything. 2 weeks into the semester, Jaime texted me a bunch of screenshots that made my stomach drop. Tina had been messaging all our high school friends on Facebook with this whole made-up story about how I was stealing money from our parents and had developed drug problems at college. She claimed I'd been asking family members for money to support my habits, and that's why I'd cut her off. Most people who knew me weren't buying it, Jaime said. But I could see from the screenshots that some people were starting to ask questions and wonder if maybe there was some truth to it. I was sitting in the library, trying to focus on my chemistry homework when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was the detective who'd been handling my case, and he had news that made me put my head down on the desk. They'd traced those blackmail emails I'd been getting to a coffee shop 3 blocks from Tina's apartment. The security footage showed her sitting there with her laptop at the exact times the emails were sent. The detective said they finally had enough evidence to move forward with charges. The next day, I met with the prosecutor at the courthouse downtown. She walked me through what would happen next. Tina would be arrested, then there'd be an arraignment where she'd enter a plea, and they'd probably offer her some kind of deal, since it was her first offense. Then she looked at me and said the thing I'd been dreading. 3 days later, I was in my economics class when my phone started buzzing nonstop. I stepped out into the hallway and saw 5 missed calls from my mom. When I called back, she was screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She kept saying I was evil, that I was destroying our family, that I couldn't possibly be her daughter if I could do something like this. Then my dad took the phone, and his voice was cold and flat when he spoke. A week later, I sat in the back row of the courtroom with Leonard on one side and Dr. Rodriguez on the other. My hands were shaking as I watched them bring Tina in for her arraignment. She pleaded not guilty, which the prosecutor had warned me would probably happen, and the judge released her on bail with a no-contact order that meant she couldn't come near me or try to communicate with me in any way. As she walked out of the courtroom with her lawyer, she turned and looked right at me, mouthing words I could read clearly, even from across the room. "I love you, sister." With that mocking look in her eyes. That same afternoon, Aunt Carol called me while I was walking back to my dorm. She'd been doing her own digging, talking to cousins and other family members I hadn't seen in years. It turned out Tina had been cruel to a lot of them too, especially the younger cousins. But everyone had been too scared or embarrassed to say anything. Carol was putting together a whole pattern of behavior that went back to when we were little kids, documenting everything people remembered. The stress of everything was making it impossible to focus on school. I'd sit in class, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking to see if somehow Tina was there, even though I knew about the no-contact order. My chemistry grade dropped from an A to a C in just 3 weeks, and I couldn't concentrate long enough to read more than a page of any textbook. Dr. Rodriguez officially diagnosed me with PTSD during one of our sessions and recommended we increase our meetings to twice a week to help me cope with everything. 2 weeks after the arraignment, I was doing laundry in my dorm basement when I checked my phone and saw 3 new voicemails from my mom's number. My heart started racing because I knew something was wrong. Mom never left voicemails. When I played the first one, it wasn't Mom's voice at all. The prosecutor added witness intimidation charges the next morning after I brought her the voicemails. She played them for the judge at an emergency hearing that afternoon, and he revoked Tina's bail immediately. I stood on the courthouse steps and watched through the glass doors as 2 officers led my sister away in handcuffs, her wrists locked behind her back. I waited for guilt or sadness or something to hit me, but all I felt was relief, like I could finally breathe again for the first time in weeks. The next morning, a courier knocked on my dorm room door with a thick envelope from Brennan, Hayes, and Associates, the most expensive law firm in Columbus. My hands shook as I opened it and read the formal letter telling me I should reconsider my position and warning about destroying family bonds permanently while hinting at potential legal action against me for defamation. Leonard found me sitting on my bed 20 minutes later, still holding the letter, and immediately called the prosecutor's office while I just sat there feeling numb. The prosecutor told us not to worry, that this was typical intimidation tactics. But I couldn't stop thinking about how my parents were spending thousands of dollars to defend the person who'd been hurting me my whole life. A week later, Dr. Rodriguez cleared her entire afternoon to help me write my victim impact statement. And every single sentence felt like pulling glass out of my skin. I wrote about the stuffed bunny, the flushed necklace, the ruined graduation, party, and all the little cuts in between that added up to 20 years of pain. She helped me find the words when I couldn't, sitting quietly while I cried through paragraphs about how Tina didn't just steal my childhood, but tried to steal my future too. That same week, Leonard's mom called and officially invited me to move in with them for the summer, saying their guest room was already set up and waiting for me. She sat with me in their kitchen and told me how her own sister had cut off toxic family members years ago, and how chosen family could be stronger than blood. And I accepted their offer, feeling like I was finally finding solid ground after months of earthquakes. Jaime had to testify in a deposition the following Tuesday. She brought the video from my graduation party on her phone, showing it frame by frame to the prosecutor and Tina's lawyer. The prosecutor called me afterward to say it was powerful evidence of a pattern of public humiliation and targeted harassment, especially the part where Tina grabbed the microphone away when I tried to stop her. 2 weeks after that, I was helping Leonard's mom make dinner when we heard pounding on the front door and my mother's voice screaming that she knew I was in there. Leonard's mom told me to stay in the kitchen while she answered the door, but I could hear everything as Linda pushed past her, demanding to see me. I walked into the living room, and Linda's face went red when she saw me, screaming about how Tina could go to prison and asking if that's what I wanted, my own sister in prison. When I didn't answer or move toward her, she crossed the room in 3 steps and slapped me hard across the face, the sound echoing through the house. Leonard's mom immediately pulled out her phone and called 911 while Linda kept screaming at me about family loyalty and how I was destroying everything. The police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested Linda for assault while I stood there with Leonard's mom's arm around me, my cheeks still burning. I had to file another police report at the station, and the detective told me that family violence often escalates during legal proceedings, which didn't make me feel any better about having to watch my own mother get handcuffed. The next day, I went back to my childhood home while my parents were at work to pack up the few things I wanted to keep. I sat in my old bedroom for the last time, looking at every object and remembering how Tina had broken my jewelry box, torn my posters, stolen my diary, and read it aloud to her friends. I left most of it behind, taking only a few photos and my old debate trophies, closing the door on that room and that life forever. A month later, the prosecutor called to tell me they'd offered Tina a plea deal of 2 years probation, mandatory therapy, and a permanent restraining order, which seemed reasonable to me. But Tina refused it, insisting on going to trial because she wanted her day in court to tell her side of the story. The prosecutor explained that narcissists often do this because they want to perform. They want the attention and the chance to play victim in front of an audience. 3 days after that conversation, a package arrived at Leonard's house addressed to me with no return address. Inside was my old stuffed bunny from when I was 5, the one Tina had ripped the head off, now crudely sewn back together with black thread. The note just said, "Fixed it for you," and was signed Mom. But something about it felt more like a threat than any kind of apology or peace offering. Meanwhile, Aunt Carol had been quietly documenting everything she could find, going through old boxes in my parents' attic and creating a timeline that went back 20 years. She found report cards from elementary school with teacher comments about me seeming withdrawn and anxious around my sister. Found my old journals that I thought were lost. Found photos where you could see me flinching away from Tina even as a toddler. The pattern had always been there, written in a dozen different handwritings from teachers and counselors and coaches who'd all noticed something was wrong, but never quite connected the dots. 2 months later, I decided to start something on campus that I never thought I'd have the guts to do. I booked a small room in the student center and put up flyers about a support group for people who'd survived family abuse. The first meeting, I sat there with my notebook and 3 chairs set up in a circle, watching the door and wondering if anyone would even show up. A girl named Ashley walked in first, then a guy named Ben, then another girl who just went by Kay. We sat there for an hour and mostly just looked at each other. But by the end, Ashley was crying about her stepdad, and Ben was talking about his older brother who used to lock him in closets. By the fourth meeting, we had 12 people and had to move to a bigger room. The prosecutor called me that same week to tell me the trial date was set for 6 months out. I tried to focus on my classes, but the notice that I'd have to testify came in the mail 2 days later, and I threw up right there in my dorm room. Leonard held my hair back while I heaved into the trash can, and Dr. Rodriguez spent our whole next session reminding me that I was stronger than I knew, that I'd already survived the worst part. I was at the grocery store near campus when Mrs. Davis from back home spotted me in the cereal aisle. She pulled me into this big hug before I could back away and said my mom missed me so much that she looked terrible without me. The guilt hit me like a punch to the stomach, and I left my whole cart right there in the aisle. Drove back to my apartment crying so hard I could barely see the road. 2 weeks after that, things got worse. Tina's lawyer filed a motion saying I was mentally unstable, and my testimony shouldn't count for anything. They wanted all my therapy records, every single session with Dr. Rodriguez, every private thing I'd ever said. Dr. Rodriguez sat me down and explained what was coming, how they'd try to use my PTSD diagnosis against me, how they'd twist everything to make me look crazy. The judge ended up limiting what they could see, but Tina's lawyer still got permission to question Dr. Rodriguez about my diagnosis in court. My old English teacher reached out on Facebook after she heard about the case from another teacher. She remembered finding me crying in the bathroom after Tina had humiliated me in front of the whole cafeteria junior year. Remembered how I'd begged her not to tell anyone because it would just make things worse. She offered to testify about what she'd seen over the years. I started writing everything down in a private blog, just trying to get it all out of my head. The words came out like poison being pulled from a wound. Page after page of memories I'd tried to forget. Leonard read some of it with my permission, and just held me while I sobbed into his chest for an hour. A month later, my dad sent me a letter through my lawyer. He was filing for divorce from my mom after she got arrested for helping Tina. He wrote that he'd failed to protect me, but still didn't want Tina to go to jail, that she was still his daughter, and maybe we could all get therapy together someday. I read it 3 times and then threw it in the trash without answering. The prosecutor showed me something that made my skin crawl during our next meeting. Security footage from the coffee shop near my dorm, from the library, from the parking garage, all showing Tina following me for weeks before the blackmail started. She'd been learning my schedule, figuring out when I'd be alone, planning the whole thing like some kind of sick game. The prosecutor said the premeditation would make the charges way more serious. I was sitting in my psychology lecture the next week when someone behind me laughed in this high, mean way that sounded exactly like Tina. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just grabbed my stuff and ran out of the room. I spent an hour in the bathroom trying to get my breathing under control, splashing cold water on my face and doing the counting exercises Dr. Rodriguez had taught me. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Dr. Rodriguez's office staring at this light bar thing she was holding while she explained something called EMDR that could help with trauma memories. She moved the light back and forth while I thought about Tina ripping my bunny's head off, and my eyes followed it. And suddenly I was sobbing harder than I had in years. But somehow the memory felt different afterwards, like watching it through thick glass instead of living it again. The next day, Aunt Carol called Leonard crying because she'd been talking to her daughter Emma about the trial, and Emma broke down and told her that Tina had cut up her wedding dress with scissors the night before her wedding 6 years ago, and then convinced everyone Emma did it herself during a panic attack about getting married. Emma had been in therapy ever since, thinking she'd had some kind of breakdown. But now she realized Tina had done it, and she wanted to testify, and Aunt Carol kept saying she was so sorry for not believing me. My grades started getting better once I figured out how to push the legal stuff into a separate box in my brain during classes. And my economics professor pulled me aside after I aced the midterm and offered me a research assistant position for next semester, which felt like the first normal good thing to happen in months. A month later, the pre-trial hearing started. And even though I didn't have to go, I read all the transcripts online. And Tina's lawyer kept trying to get the whole thing thrown out, saying it was just a family dispute and not a criminal matter. But the judge wrote that the evidence of premeditation and the severity of the acts clearly put it in criminal territory. I was walking to my Tuesday morning statistics class when campus security ran past me toward the humanities building. I followed and saw Linda standing there with a giant poster board sign that said, Forgive your family, while students took pictures with their phones. Security grabbed her arms and she started screaming that I was destroying our family and that God would punish me for turning my back on blood. They dragged her to their car while she kept yelling. I found out later she got arrested again for violating the restraining order. 2 weeks after that, the prosecutor had me come in for prep sessions where she made me practice answering questions while she acted like Tina's lawyer, trying to make me look crazy or vindictive. And she kept stopping me when I got emotional and teaching me to take a breath and answer with just facts. At the courthouse for one of these sessions, I met this woman named Ashley in the bathroom who was crying. And when I asked if she was okay, she said her sister had tormented her for 20 years and she was finally pressing charges. We exchanged numbers and started texting every day because she understood what it was like when everyone says you should just forgive family. Leonard found a USB drive in a box of my old stuff from home. And when we plugged it in, it had all these home videos from when I was little. And in every single one, you could see Tina doing something mean while smiling at the camera, like pinching me hard enough to make me cry, or stepping on my toys, or pulling my hair while my parents filmed birthday parties or Christmas morning, completely focused on the camera and never noticing what was happening right in front of them. A week before the trial, Tina's lawyer released this statement to the Columbus Dispatch, calling me a troubled young woman seeking attention and making up stories about my loving sister. And by lunch, it was all over social media with people from high school taking sides. And my support group from campus? They all commented on the article with their own stories about siblings who abused them. Leonard's mom, who works in social services, started calling around and found 3 different therapists who had treated people from Tina's various jobs over the years for workplace bullying. And while they couldn't break confidentiality to testify, they all set off the record that Tina had a clear pattern of targeting one person at each job until that person either quit or had a breakdown. The prosecutor said this info would help show a pattern, even if the therapist couldn't testify directly. 2 weeks later, we were sitting in the courthouse for jury selection, and I watched person after person get asked about their views on family. One woman said families should always forgive each other no matter what and got dismissed immediately. Another guy kept talking about how siblings fight all the time, and it's normal, so he got cut too. The prosecutor wanted people who understood that family members could be abusers, just like anyone else. 3 days before the trial started, Dr. Rodriguez had me come in for an extra session, and something just clicked while I was talking. I realized I'd spent my whole life protecting my parents from seeing how bad things really were with Tina. I never told them about the worst stuff because I didn't want to cause problems or make them choose sides. I was so busy trying to be the good daughter who didn't make waves that I let Tina destroy me piece by piece. The night before trial, I was in my hotel room with Leonard going over my notes when my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered and heard my dad's voice, all slurred and drunk, saying he wished I'd never been born because then none of this would be happening to their family. Leonard grabbed the phone from me and hung up while I just sat there shaking. The next morning, Jaime showed up at my hotel after flying in from California, where she'd moved for work. We stayed up late that night looking through our old yearbooks, and she pointed out picture after picture where you could see me trying to stay away from Tina at school events. She remembered all the times teachers would say we were just being sisters when I'd show up to class with red eyes from crying. Trial day 1 started with opening statements, and I felt sick watching Tina sit there in this conservative outfit I'd never seen her wear before. The prosecutor laid out 20 years of escalating abuse with dates and examples, while Tina's lawyer kept calling it sibling rivalry that got blown out of proportion. Tina actually dabbed at her eyes with a tissue like she was the victim here. The next day, they played the graduation party video, and you could see some jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats watching Tina grab that microphone. Her lawyer kept objecting, saying it was prejudicial, but the judge let it play as evidence of pattern behavior. During the lunch recess, I was walking back from the bathroom when I saw Tina in the hallway. She looked right at me and smiled this sweet, fake smile, then mouthed the words, "I love you, sister," with this mocking look in her eyes that made my skin crawl. I had to run to the bathroom and throw up. Day 2 of the trial, they called me to testify, and I sat in that witness chair trying to keep my voice steady. I told them about the bunny when I was 5, and how she'd looked me in the eye while ripping its head off. I talked about the necklace she flushed and the clothes she ruined, and the rumors she spread. My voice only cracked once when I described finding my bunny's head in my backpack at school the next day where she'd put it. Several jurors looked really bothered by that story. Then came cross-examination, and Tina's lawyer went after me hard. He suggested I was jealous of my successful older sister and that I was vindictive and possibly mentally unstable. He kept trying to twist my words, but I just kept saying, "That's not true," and sticking to the facts like Dr. Rodriguez had taught me. He asked why I waited so long to report anything, and I said, "Because my parents always told me it was just sister stuff." After I finished testifying, they called my old English teacher, Mrs. Jones, who'd driven up from our hometown. She brought this old teaching journal where she'd written notes about finding me crying in the hallway multiple times, always after seeing Tina. She had dates and everything written down from years ago about how concerned she was. The prosecutor called up my cousin Rachel next, and she looked so small walking to the witness stand with her hands shaking as she gripped a tissue. Rachel started talking about Tina's wedding 3 years ago, when she was a bridesmaid, and how Tina had destroyed her dress the night before by pouring red wine all over it while laughing. She broke down crying when she described how Tina convinced everyone at the wedding that Rachel had gotten drunk and ruined her own dress out of jealousy. The prosecutor showed photos of the ruined dress and text messages where Tina bragged about it to her friends. Rachel's voice cracked when she said Tina enjoys hurting people, and the jury members were writing notes while some looked disgusted. After Rachel stepped down, the cybercrime detective took the stand with a thick folder of evidence and started explaining the digital harassment campaign in detail. He showed IP addresses traced to Tina's devices and timestamps, proving she'd been sending hateful messages to me at all hours for months. The fake social media account she created had my photos edited in horrible ways, and she'd posted them on sites I can't even describe here. The detective explained how sophisticated and planned everything was, with spreadsheets tracking when to send messages for maximum psychological impact. During the lunch break, I was sitting alone in the hallway when my dad walked up, looking like he'd aged 10 years since I last saw him. His suit was wrinkled and his eyes were red as he stood there just staring at me before saying he was sorry and that he sees what she is now. I didn't forgive him, but I nodded because what else could I do after everything that had happened between us? When court resumed that afternoon, Tina finally took the stand in her own defense, wearing this innocent white dress like she was some kind of victim. She started crying immediately and claimed I'd always been jealous of her and was making everything up for attention because I couldn't handle being the less successful sister. Her lawyer lobbed her easy questions, and she answered with a sweet voice I'd never heard her use before while dabbing at fake tears. The jury seemed to be buying it until the prosecutor started cross-examination and asked her about the video from my graduation party. She tried to deny it at first, but when he played the footage of her giving that horrible speech, her whole face changed. The prosecutor kept pushing and showing evidence, and finally, Tina snapped and screamed that I deserved it because I was always trying to make her look bad. The entire courtroom went silent, and I saw jury members lean back in their chairs as they finally saw the real Tina underneath the act. The next day was character witnesses, and my professors testified about how I'd been a good student who suddenly started missing classes after the harassment began. My boss from my campus job described finding me crying in the storage room multiple times, and Leonard talked about the night terrors I'd been having. Jaime showed texts where I'd begged her to help me figure out what I'd done wrong to make Tina hate me so much. That night, back at my apartment, I couldn't sleep and kept replaying Tina's testimony over and over in my head. The way she'd lied, so easily and convincingly at first, made me doubt myself, even though I knew the truth, because that's what years of gaslighting does to you. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, thinking about how she'd almost made me believe I was the problem again, just like when we were kids. The 5th day of trial was closing arguments. The prosecutor laid out the pattern of escalation from childhood bullying to criminal harassment and stalking. He showed the timeline of how things got worse after I cut contact and emphasized how Tina showed no remorse even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. The defense lawyer argued it was just family dysfunction and sibling rivalry that got out of hand, but not criminal behavior that deserved jail time. While the jury went to deliberate, I sat in the hallway with Leonard holding my hand and Jaime on my other side, with Aunt Carol across from us. Carol looked at me and said, "Whatever happens, you've already won by breaking free." But I wasn't sure I believed that yet. We'd been waiting for 2 hours when there was shouting from outside, and security guards rushed past us toward the courthouse entrance. Linda had shown up, violating her restraining order again, and was screaming at reporters that I'd destroyed our family while trying to push past security to get inside. The guards grabbed her arms as she tried to lunge at me through the doorway, yelling that I was a liar who turned everyone against them. The cops showed up within minutes and arrested her for violating the restraining order, while the bailiff told us to get back inside. We spent the rest of that day just sitting in the hallway, waiting for any news, but nothing came. The next morning, the prosecutor found us in the same spot and said the jury had asked to see the graduation video and all the cybercrime evidence again, which meant they were taking it seriously. I couldn't eat anything, and Leonard kept bringing me water that I couldn't drink while we watched other cases get called and resolved around us. Dr. Rodriguez showed up around noon and sat with us for a while and told me that no matter what happened, I'd already won by standing up to them, and that Tina didn't define me anymore. Something about hearing that made me realize she was right, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of my sister. The third day started the same way with us back in those hard plastic chairs when suddenly the bailiff came out and said the jury was back. My hands started shaking so bad I could barely stand up. As we filed back into the courtroom and watched the jury take their seats, the foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper, and I grabbed Leonard's hand so tight I thought I might break it. "Guilty on all counts," he said, "including harassment and blackmail and witness intimidation." Tina's face went from smug to shocked to pure rage in about 3 seconds. The judge started talking about scheduling, but Tina jumped up and lunged across the defense table toward me, screaming that I'd ruined her life. 2 court officers grabbed her, but she kept fighting and kicking while screaming threats about what she'd do to me when she got out. The judge slammed his gavel and added contempt of court to her charges while they dragged her out, still screaming. He scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, and the prosecutor explained that with multiple felonies plus her behavior today, she was looking at 2 to 5 years in prison. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, and I gave them one short statement about hoping this would help other abuse survivors seek justice even when the abuser was family. Then we went to Leonard's house, where I completely fell apart and cried for what felt like hours while his mom made tea and his dad ordered pizza, and they just let me cry. My support group threw me a small party the next week, and one woman said I'd given them all hope that they could stand up to their own abusers. A week after that, I got a letter from Robert with a check for my entire college fund that Linda had tried to withdraw before the restraining order went through. He wrote that he'd moved out and filed for divorce and started therapy, and that he knew he'd failed me but was trying to do better. 6 weeks later, we were back in court for sentencing, and Tina got 3 years in prison, plus 2 years probation and mandatory psychological treatment. She had to be physically dragged out of the courtroom screaming that I would pay for this, and that she'd make me sorry when she got out. The prosecutor filed for the permanent restraining order that same day, and the judge approved it immediately. Even after Tina got out of prison, she could never contact me again or come within 500 feet of me. If she violated it, she'd go straight back to jail. I could finally breathe without looking over my shoulder. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand what I was really feeling during our next session. She said I was mourning the family I should have had, not the one I actually got. That made so much sense because I wasn't sad about losing them. I was sad about never having real parents or a real sister in the first place. 2 weeks later, Linda sent a letter through her lawyer saying she was disowning me completely. She was writing me out of her will and erasing me from the family like I never existed. Leonard and Jaime came over that night, and we burned the letter in my backyard fire pit. Watching those hateful words turn to ash felt like freedom. 2 months later, I went to the courthouse and legally changed my last name to Smith, which was Leonard's mom's maiden name. His family had basically adopted me anyway, and they were more than happy about it. The paperwork felt like taking off chains I'd worn my whole life. When I went back to campus for sophomore year, everything was different. My grades were great. I got the research position I wanted, and I helped expand the support group for abuse survivors. We went from 5 members to almost 30. Trauma didn't control me anymore. Aunt Carol hosted Thanksgiving that year with me, Leonard, his parents, his sister, and the cousin who had testified for me. We cooked together and laughed, and nobody screamed or threw things or made cruel speeches. Leonard's dad made a toast to chosen family and new beginnings. I cried happy tears for the first time in years. A few weeks later, I wrote an anonymous article about sibling abuse for the campus newspaper. Within days, my inbox was flooded with messages from other students sharing their own stories. Some had never told anyone before. I started a weekly coffee meetup for anyone who wanted to talk. During one of my therapy sessions in December, Dr. Rodriguez pointed out that I hadn't mentioned Tina once in our last 3 meetings. She was right. I hadn't even thought about her. The constant fear and anxiety were finally fading. In January, Aunt Carol called to tell me Robert had been reaching out to her. He'd moved into a small apartment, started therapy, and was going to support groups for parents who enabled abuse. He wanted her to tell me he was working on himself and understood if I never wanted to see him again. Maybe someday we could try to rebuild something. But not now, and not soon. By spring semester, Leonard and I had moved into a small apartment near campus. We sat on our secondhand couch one night, planning out our junior year schedules and summer internships. My phone stayed quiet the whole time. No angry texts, no guilt trips, no threats, no fear. I'd built a life that Tina couldn't touch, surrounded by people who actually loved me. For the first time since I was a little kid with that stuffed bunny, I felt completely and truly safe.